Well, thank you, Ian, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to be taking part in this day with you, and I look forward to some question and answer session at the end of this monologue. I noticed that the banner behind me said that leaders engage in dialogue, not just monologue, so I'm looking forward to the dialogue as well as the monologue. So as Ian said, the title that we've agreed on today is Reforming Education in Australia, What Matters. Obviously school education is very much on the agenda. Right now there's a lot of discussion around reforming or reviewing the Australian curriculum, discussions around funding, obviously following the Gonski committee, a lot of discussion about the best ways to fund schools, the best ways to prioritise the use of funding. Discussions around how we best prepare teachers, whether we should be setting standards for teachers on entry into the profession, whether or not we should be setting standards for entry into teacher education courses, the standards that we should be setting for those courses themselves. And I think a lot of this discussion comes out of a level of concern that's been generated by the evidence that we've been seeing over the past decade about the performances of children in Australia, in all our schools across the country. And that evidence is being collected through programs like NAPLAN, but also through our involvement in international studies, the TIMS study, the Trends in International Mathematics and Science study, the PEARLS study, the Progress in International Reading Literacy study, and of course PISA, the OECD's Program for International Student Assessment. So there's a level of concern about the performances of Australian students in basic areas like reading and mathematics and science, and questions are being asked of the kind that I've just been mentioning about the strategies we should be adopting to address those concerns. But I guess at another level, the question of how we best meet the needs of children and young people in our care, the question of how we do whatever we can to ensure that all students are achieving their potential, are questions that go right to the heart of our work as educators. These are core questions, not just for governments and education systems to worry about, but they're core questions for all of us, as I say, who call ourselves educators. So another way of describing what I'd like to say something about briefly this morning is how can we better meet the needs of all students in our schools and give every student a chance to achieve their potential. Yes, governments are concerned, but it's a concern for all of us as educators how we can continue to do a better job of meeting the needs of students and helping them live up to and achieve their potential. But let's just quickly take a look at some of the evidence that we've collected over the past decade and some of the evidence that has led to concerns on the part of governments about the performances of students in our schools. One of the observations that has been made is that students in many countries and economies, jurisdictions, are currently performing at higher levels than students in Australia. Now, of course, there are many reasons why that's likely to be the case, but if we look at the results from international studies, we see that often Australia is a long way down the rank order of participating countries. I don't want to make too much of this slide because it could be inferred, for example, that by year 8 we're doing better than we are at year 4. Difficult to draw those sorts of conclusions because different numbers of countries participate at these different year levels. So I don't want to make too much of this slide, but I do want to just make the point that when you look at this in areas like year 4 reading, year 4 mathematics, year 4 science, there are many countries that are significantly outperforming us in those areas, and the question is being asked, what would we need to do to lift levels of achievement within Australia? And the concerns often come from a concern about what the implications of this are for the future. How competitive are we going to be as a country in areas like mathematics and science and technology? Are we going to become just a consumer rather than a producer of advances in technology, for example? So what are the consequences, the implications for national productivity, for our competitiveness as a nation into the future? So that's one level of concern. Another concern is that when we look at what's been happening over the period for which we have data, there's not a lot of evidence that our students in Australia have been improving over time. There are some areas in which we can see improvement. For example, in Year 4 mathematics, between 1995 and 2011, there was a statistically significant improvement in levels of achievement. Not to the same extent that there was in England, for example, and the USA throughout that period has been outperforming us. England appears to have commenced that period going back to 1995, slightly below Australia, but moved ahead of us and is now quite significantly ahead of us. But over that period, it is true that there's been an improvement in achievement levels in Year 4 mathematics. Not so true in Year 8 science, in fact not at all true in Year 8 science. Over that period we've pretty much flatlined. There's been no significant improvement in levels of Year 8 mathematics nationally, and you can see there's a huge gap between Australia and the highest performing countries in the world, and those highest performing countries have actually been improving, statistically significantly improving their levels of Year 8 mathematics achievement over that time. This gap, we estimate, the gap between the best in the world and Australia on average at Year 8 represents about 3.5 years of schooling. So on average, in places like Korea and Taiwan, Chinese Taipei, students by Year 8 are ahead of us, on average of course, ahead of us by about 3.5 years. Similarly, in Year 4 science, there have been improvements in some other countries, but we have pretty much flatlined over that period of time. And Year 8 science, again, some countries moving ahead of us, some countries significantly outperforming us, but when we look at the trend over that time, Australia has pretty much stayed stable, no significant improvement, no significant decline either. So, as I said, not only is there evidence that there are many countries that are significantly outperforming Australia, there's also evidence that there's improvement occurring in a number of other countries, but not so on the main within Australia. The evidence we have is that things are pretty stable, they're flatlining over the last decade or so, with not much evidence of change at all. So there are reasons that governments sometimes become concerned. At the same time, if we just look within Australia, forget about the international for a minute, if we just look within Australia, we can ask the question about gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, or gaps between our lowest and highest socioeconomic groups within this country. And once again, the evidence there is not reassuring at all. We've spent a huge amount of money trying to address these gaps, to raise the tail of the distribution, to improve the performances of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. But if one looks at the evidence over the period of the PISA studies, the 5 PISA studies, and compares the performance of Indigenous students with non-Indigenous Australians, you can see that the gap has stayed pretty stable throughout that period. So there's been no closing of the gap in terms of reading at 15 years of age. Similarly in mathematics, a bit of a downward slope here, decline for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in mathematics. And in science, not so much of a decline, but the gap is pretty much unchanged through that period of time. Looking at socioeconomic groups, data haven't been collected through PISA in a way that allows us to go back to the start of PISA, but over the last 3 cycles of the PISA studies, you can see that the gap between our lowest quartile, the lowest socioeconomic quartile, and the highest socioeconomic quartile has remained pretty stable over that period. At 15 years of age in reading, in mathematics, again, slight decline over that period for the low SES and perhaps the high as well. And in science, the gap has been pretty much maintained. So the conclusion from all of that is that a number of studies, a number of these international studies in particular, are telling us that the achievement levels of Australian students are well behind achievement levels in a number of other countries, not just East Asian countries where there may be other explanations, but often well behind other countries with which we would often compare ourselves, like Canada and New Zealand and the UK perhaps, that there's not much change occurring over that period of time, and that within Australia the gaps that we've spent billions of dollars, I guess, often trying to address appear not to be closing. So all of that means that governments are very focused on this question, concerned, frustrated, I think, often, that what's been attempted doesn't seem to have been having an impact. And they recognise that there are influences over which schools have no control, over which governments have relatively little control, perhaps. And I also just want to make the observation that I recognise that in a transformational sense, we might expect that there'll be significant changes in the way that education occurs into the future, particularly as a result of technology. But the focus of my presentation this morning is on the sorts of policies and practices that we as educators and education systems and governments have a degree of control over, recognising that there is that external context, a changing context in which schools are working, and as we've been hearing this morning, many things going on in society, in families, over which we have little or often no control. But the focus is on what we can do. So what governments and education systems very often do is to look for levers. What can we do about this? What's likely to make a difference? And I've just listed some of these on the next slide, and I've referred to them as macro reform strategies. By that I mean things that governments try to do, things that education systems try to do to address the issues that I've been talking about. And they're things like more money, increasing the funding that's available to education, perhaps allocating the money differently, prioritising areas of need, smaller class sizes, making schools more autonomous. Big movement right now within a number of our government school systems to make schools more autonomous, more independent, independent public schools movement. Hold people accountable. Make it clear what we want to see happening, and hold individuals accountable. System leaders, school leaders, teachers, create a culture of accountability and a culture of performance. Collect evidence regularly, test regularly, make the results available, make how we're performing more transparent, so that parents can make choices, for example, about which schools they're going to send their students to, their children to. Perhaps that would make a difference. So you've heard all these things discussed. Improvement incentives. Perhaps if we rewarded people for improved levels of achievement, if we made money available to schools that showed evidence of improvement, if we paid teachers who improved their results more money, performance pay arrangements, perhaps that's the solution. Or perhaps sanctions. This has been tried in other parts of the world. If you're not performing, we will come in, we will intervene. The US No Child Left Behind approach. will get more involved if you're not showing regular improvement in your results. And in the extreme, we'll dismiss the leadership of the school, we'll close the school down, we'll really come in and be heavy-handed and see what we can do. So these things happen, and they're strategies that governments and education systems use from time to time. I was talking to a Deputy Director General in one of the government systems here a couple of weeks ago, and they said to me, I've told my regional leaders that if we don't improve our NAPLAN results, their jobs are on the line. So it's that kind of threat that you sometimes hear. This is in the basket of sanctions or threats, with the idea that somehow that's going to lift results. Setting targets, big, hairy, audacious goals. Let's be number 5 in the world by 2025. Maybe if we set some ambitious targets, that will get us there. Results will start to improve. If we're clear about what we want to see being taught, what we want students learning, standards for teachers, perhaps expectations or standards, will be an effective strategy for lifting results. Perhaps if teachers are better qualified, maybe if they have master's degrees, as teachers do in Finland, for example, that will lead to better results. So there are lots of strategies, and there are others that you could add. There are lots of strategies that governments and systems think about as ways of improving results. But I have to say that there's evidence that a number of these strategies actually don't work or they haven't worked in practice. There are places where they've been tried and they haven't led to improved results. I'm not saying here that they can't lead to improved results. I'm simply saying that in a number of places where a number of these macro strategies have been attempted, nothing's improved as a result. And a good example of that would be the notion of incentives. The idea that if you provide rewards, financial rewards usually, or sanctions or threats, that will lead to improvement. But the evidence internationally is that systems that try to do that have not been successful in producing improved results. And in fact, a lot of the time, most of the time perhaps, they end up achieving things that they didn't want to achieve. People game the system. They distort their practice. They find other ways to make the results look good so that you get score inflation on tests that isn't reflected in real levels of achievement, for example. So a number of these schemes, there's not a lot of evidence that they work in practice. And I think the reason often is that the assumption that underpins these strategies is wrong. Often the assumption is that the real problem is lack of effort. If we could just get people working harder, then things would improve. Do you see what I'm saying? If we offered them rewards, or if we threatened them, they know how to do it, they're just not trying hard enough. If I set ambitious targets for the country, then people will know how to get there. They'll just lift their game so that we do get there. So many of these strategies could work, some do work, but many of them in practice have not worked, and I think often it's because as I say, the underlying assumptions are wrong, and often the mechanisms by which they are supposed to achieve improvement are not clear. But I'm not saying that they can't approach differently, lead to improvement. A general observation I'd make is that strategies of this kind are likely to improve outcomes in schools, improve the quality of learning, improve levels of achievement, only to the extent that they enhance the quality of provision in schools. And so what I'm saying here is there are a whole lot of macro strategies that sit up here in the air, but don't always connect with day-to-day practice on the ground. They don't actually change what happens on the ground every school day of the week. And if we're going to achieve improvement of the kind that we would like to see as educators, governments would like to see, education systems would like to see, we have to think much more clearly than we have been about the mechanisms by which some of these macro strategies, as I'm calling them, are going to impact on and change practice in schools, what I'm referring to here as micro reform. So general questions that I would ask of these strategies are, as I said, how is this supposed to work? And often when you sit back and look at them, you wonder, okay, so you're going to do that. You're going to set a target of being fifth in the world, in the top 5 by 2025. What's the mechanism that's going to lead to improvement, for example? What's the evidence that this has actually worked in practice? There are systems in Australia right now that are rushing to introduce incentive schemes, performance pay, financial rewards for lifting results. But where's the evidence that that's actually working around the world? And importantly, what are the unintended, the unanticipated consequences of doing what you're proposing? Could this actually distort the work of schools? Could it have an unintended and undesirable impact on the culture of schools? Let me just talk for a little bit about one specific example, the reform of the curriculum. Because, and we've heard this just over the last week or two, people who reform the curriculum often see that as the way to bring about improvement. If we have a better curriculum, and this may be true, if we have a better curriculum, a more rigorous curriculum, a more demanding curriculum, then results are going to improve, our students will perform better as a consequence. So it's a common approach, and we see it in our work internationally. ACER now is working in quite a number of countries around the world. We're working in places like Afghanistan. We've just, with UN agencies, collected the first and the best data available about achievement levels in Afghanistan. We're working in Bangladesh, India, Zimbabwe, Abu Dhabi, across the United Arab Emirates. And what we see and other places as well, but what we often see in these countries is that the leaders of the education system and leaders in government are coming to the conclusion that to lift standards within their countries, what they need to do is to have a rigorous curriculum. And so they will say, okay, where can we find around the world the best curriculum? Let's go to Scandinavia, let's go to Singapore, and let's import it. Adapt it maybe, but let's import it. And that way our students will be being held to high expectations. And so teachers are expected to teach to those curricula with high standards, and students are expected to learn and to master those curricula. The next step is they then come to ACER or a place like ACER and say to us, as all those places I mentioned have recently, will you now assess our students so that we can see how they're performing against these high standards that we've set? And one of my colleagues, the head of ACER's Sydney office, Chris Freeman, is in the room, and he's been directly involved in this in Abu Dhabi and the UAE. What we're finding is that very often students in these countries are not even on the dial. They're performing so far below the curriculum expectations that it's hard for us to even say anything very meaningful about their levels of achievement at all. So these countries are setting high standards in the belief that this is the way to lift levels of achievement, but there's a question about how effective that is. And curriculum reform often is linked to a traditional view and the standard view of the way we organise schools. A number of years ago, Linda Darling-Hammond, an American academic, talked about the way we organise schools as something like an assembly line. She said we have students start at kindergarten, or whatever we call the beginning of school, and they move along this assembly line, this conveyor belt, from one year to the next, and at each stage on the assembly line, they delivered the curriculum considered appropriate for the year level, and then they move along to the next stage on the conveyor belt and they delivered the curriculum for the next year of school. So it's a kind of industrial model of schooling that we have here. So this approach that we often take to developing curricula is based on that underpinning way of organising schools, and the idea is that if we develop clear, explicit statements of what students should be learning in each year of school, if we benchmark those against international best practice so that we have demanding or high standards in our curricula, and if we then assess students and even better, from a transparency point of view, publicly report on how students are performing against this curriculum that we've developed, then achievement levels, as I say, will improve. But there are a couple of assumptions underpinning that model. One assumption is that students of the same age, and where you're dealing with a system where you have pretty much automatic grade progression from one year to the next, of course it is the case that students in a particular year of school are more or less of the same age, but an underpinning assumption is that students of the same age should be taught and are more or less equally ready to learn the curriculum for that year of school. So they're 10, they're in year 5, best curriculum for them is the year 5 curriculum. And a related assumption, I think, is that the bulk of students do end up, one way or another, mastering most of that curriculum, and they're ready for the next year of school, so they can proceed along the assembly line and be delivered the year 6 curriculum next year. The problem, I think, is that those assumptions are really questionable. The evidence shows us that students in the same year of school are not equally ready for the year level curriculum. They're nowhere near equally ready for the curriculum that's deemed appropriate for their year level. And one way to see this is just to look at results like the NAPLAN results, or results on other assessments. And what I'm showing you on the screen here is the distributions of year 3, year 5, year 7 and year 9 reading results for the whole country. And what this picture shows is that there are some students in year 9, so I'm looking here on the far right of the picture in the tail. There are some students in year 9 who are still performing at around about the average year 3 level. Do you see what I'm saying? And you can draw horizontal lines across this to draw other sorts of conclusions. But the big observation is that there is huge overlap in these distributions. It's not the case that students move in clumps from one year to the next. In any given year of school, there are children who are spread over a very wide range of achievement levels in reading, in this case, but equally in mathematics. In fact, there's some evidence internationally that in mathematics the spread increases across the years of school. So students become more different in mathematics the longer they're in school. And I think that's partly, if you look at it even more closely, that's partly because the tail of the distribution seems to fall further behind. Children who begin to fall behind in mathematics often fall further behind the longer they're in school. So huge overlap. In fact, if you look at the evidence, what we have concluded in our work, and others have concluded the same thing in other countries, similar observations have been made in the UK and the US, for example. In any particular year of school, the most advanced 10% of students in things like reading and mathematics are about 5 to 6 years ahead of the least advanced 10% of students. So the top 10%, most advanced 10%, are about 5 to 6 years ahead of the least advanced 10%, bottom 10% of students in areas of learning like that. So it may not be the case in every classroom, but if you wanted to average, in any class of 20 students, there'd be 2 students in the room who would be 5 to 6, probably more like 6, years ahead of the lowest two achievers in the room. The other observation is that, that observation is, it appears not to be the case that students are equally ready for the curriculum that they're about to be delivered. In fact, very far from the truth. The second observation is that many students are not meeting the expectations that we're setting for them. So we set these age or year level expectations, curriculum expectations. We behave as though they've got it under their belt and they can move on to the next year of school. But in fact, when we assess them, we conclude that huge percentages of students are not close to mastering the curriculum for the year level. So what I have on the screen in front of you are results from international studies again. There are levels of achievement that are defined in these international studies. At year 4 and year 8, what I'm showing here is the percentage of students in Australia who fall at or below low in these international studies, and at that international level the conclusion has been reached that at or below low is an inadequate level of achievement. It's failure in the sense of being below some minimum standard that they consider acceptable at both year 4 and year 8. Similarly, the percentages of 15-year-olds in PISA, nationally we've agreed on a national benchmark in PISA, level 3 of PISA, and currently 36% of 15-year-olds in Australia are performing below that nationally agreed minimum standard in reading, 42% in mathematics and 34% in science. So there are significant percentages of students in our schools who are not meeting the standards, the expectations for their year levels. And of course, if you go to subgroups of the student population, then it looks even worse in some cases. The standard that we set in NAPLAN is a very, very low standard, actually. The national minimum standard by international standards is actually a very low standard. And yet we have 18% of Indigenous students across the country not meeting that very low standard in numeracy, 34% of students in year 9, and if you want to look at a subgroup of the population, Indigenous students in the Northern Territory, it's 50 to 64% of students who are below what is, I think, by general agreement, a very low expectation of numeracy in years 3, 5, 7 and 9. So, second conclusion then is our students, many of our students are not achieving the expectations that we have for them. Or another way of saying that is there's a significant gap between our expectations and actual levels of student achievement. In the international context, the authors Pritchett and Beattie, Pritchett's an economist at Harvard, they've looked at the results of studies like the ones that ACER is involved in developing countries, and they've made the observation that it's almost always the case, very, very often the case, that students in developing countries are performing well below, often 3 to 4 years below, the standards that those countries are setting. And so what they've said, as you can see here, is that a common question is, why are students so far behind the curriculum? Because when Chris and I go to the authorities in Abu Dhabi, as we have been, and tell them your students are way below the curriculum, of course there's then hand-wringing and gnashing of teeth, and the conclusion is that our schools are failing, our teachers are failing, our kids are failing. But what Pritchett and Beattie are asking is an interesting question, I think. They're saying, well, maybe it's not the kids who are failing, maybe it's the curriculum that's failing. The curriculum is so far away from where these kids actually are currently. You're setting such high expectations of them that you are setting them up for failure. Of course, it's really difficult for us to go in and tell a country your standards are too high. That's the last thing they want to hear. You have to have lower standards. They want to set high standards, world-class standards, and try to hold their students to those standards. But the consequence is, at least one consequence, is the conclusion that many of their students in those countries, most of their students, are failing. And I think we could ask the same question here in Australia. Why is our curriculum so far ahead of some of our students? That some of the gaps that I've been talking about are similarly gaps of 3 years of school, 2.5, 3 years of school between particular groups of students. So one way of thinking about this graphically is within any year level we have this huge variability that I've been talking about, 5 to 6 years of school. There are some children in our schools who are still a couple of years behind, possibly, so there's a gap there. But there's also a curricular gap at the other end of the distribution as well, often between the year level curriculum and the most advanced students in that year level. And we need to be equally concerned about that gap. The risk, I think, is that if teachers say, okay, we've got it, we now have a national curriculum, I'm a Year 8 teacher, this is a Year 8 class, my job is to teach the Year 8 curriculum, I'll then assess and grade students on how well they've learnt what I've just taught. There's a real risk that we're going to miss students in the tail of the distribution, the low end of the distribution, and they may fall further behind with each year of school. And if they don't fall further behind, at least they often may stay behind. They often may pick up the message that they're performing below standard, below expectation, that they're failing. And at the other extreme, if the teacher adopts that approach, I'm here to teach the Year 8 curriculum, I think I said, there's a risk that the most advanced students in the class won't be challenged and extended. And I think this is not just a hypothetical possibility I'm talking about here, I think. I've actually had direct conversations with teachers and with parents that have led me to be concerned about this. In another state, Year 8 being the first year of secondary school in that state, a Year 8 mathematics coordinator said to me, we don't try to work out where students are at when they start secondary school. We teach them the same mathematics curriculum for the first 12 months, and that gives us 12 months to sort out what we're dealing with. I don't know how common that practice is, but that was happening in that school. And this is, as I say, in a context where it's quite likely that there are children coming into that school, into Year 8, and doing mathematics who are 6 years ahead of some other children in their levels of mathematics. I've had a parent tell me, recount, and this is obviously just an anecdote, but a parent told me that her son had lost interest in mathematics. He's quite good at mathematics, enjoyed mathematics, doing well, but he'd moved into a new class in this new year, had lost interest in mathematics, and explained to his mother that the course was now too easy, that he was not being challenged in mathematics. So the mother, Trudy, went up to the teacher and said, do you think you could give my son some more advanced material when he finishes the work that you've set? And the teacher, Trudy told me, said, oh, we wouldn't want to do that. We wouldn't want to punish him for finishing his work early. So you can see a mindset there, and I don't know how widely this mindset exists out there in schools, but if that's the approach that's being taken by some teachers, even a few teachers, I think that's a concern. If their approach is, I set the work, it's based on the curriculum, if you finished it early, you have free time. In one state, it's almost a policy in the government schools. Kids who finish the set work have free time. One principal said in her school when she arrived, she discovered that meant they could even wander around the school, which she put a stop to pretty quickly. But it's the regional directors in that government system told me, a few years ago now, but the regional directors in that government system told me that it was standard practice in schools. Once kids had finished the set work for the lesson, to give them free time to do whatever they wanted to do. So my point is, there are challenges, I think, in addressing the needs of individual students, and it's at both ends. And the risk, as I said, is that when you have the same expectations of all students, that the least advanced will lack what's required to capitalise on what the teacher's about to teach, and the most advanced may not be challenged and extended in the ways that we should be. And maybe that's part of the reason why in this country, and again this is just speculation, maybe that's part of the reason why we see our highest achieving students declining most rapidly. The biggest decline is in the number of Australian students at 15 years of age who are at very high levels of achievement. Just throwing that out there as a question. Is it because we're now not adequately challenging and extending it? Well, let me talk now about what I referred to as micro-reform, because I think this is where the answer lies. It's not always in these macro-reform strategies, and there's a nice synergy here with the going deep. A lot of these macro strategies, in my view, are very superficial. I don't want to pick on particular governments or politicians, but, you know, saying the goal, guys, is to be 5th in the world by 2025, there's a superficiality about that as a strategy. We need to go deep. So what I'm talking about is micro-reform. And that means looking at what's done in classrooms, in schools, on a day-to-day basis. And I've just listed a few things here, and they come out of the work that I did a couple of years ago on the National School Improvement Tool. But some of these micro-strategies at the school level are things like being clear about what it is as a school we want to see improve. It could be attendance levels, it could be parent perceptions of the school, it could be academic achievement, it could be a whole range of things. But let's be clear about what we want to see improve within the school. That's a strategy that schools can adopt to make it clear, to communicate it, then to monitor whether or not progress is being made. So in highly effective schools, and this is not just my view, I'm basing this on a fairly close review of the research evidence, in highly effective schools an effort is made not just to set an improvement agenda, but then to monitor, to gather evidence, to plan the collection of evidence, to review whether improvement is occurring. To have a culture of support and high expectations. But when I say high expectations here, what I'm really meaning is high expectations that every child can make progress, can learn. It's not necessarily meaning every child will be at the Singapore level by the end of the year, but it is saying every child, if we can engage them, if we can motivate them, if we can provide appropriate learning opportunities, given where they're currently at in their learning, every child is capable of making good progress, and we should expect them to be making good progress in their learning. Using resources, human and physical, within the school to address student needs. So asking the question, how can we make best use of expertise that we have within the school? If there are specific needs that we need to be addressing within the student body, how do we use the discretionary resources we have to address those needs? Having the staff of the school work together as a team, a professional, expert team focused on the quality of the teaching and learning that's occurring in the school. So absolutely committed, taking it on as their responsibility to improve the quality of the learning, but working together collaboratively in that process. Having a clear view about the curriculum, but importantly, having a view about the hierarchical nature, the sequenced nature of the curriculum, how the things that I'm doing now are building onto what others have done before, and how they're laying the foundations for what's going to come next. I'll come back and say more about the next dot point in a little while, but a strong focus on addressing individual learning needs. And that could occur at the school level, where the school is asking the question, are there particular categories of students in this school? newly arrived students, Indigenous students, students in particular circumstances, socioeconomic circumstances perhaps, that have particular needs. How do we best address those as a school? But also at the classroom level, how as a teacher do I recognise and respond to the fact that individuals are often at very different points in their learning. Being clear about what highly effective teaching looks like. In high-performing schools, the research suggests, in high-performing schools there's quite an effort to understand what's known about effective teaching strategies and to then get those adopted as widely as possible through the school. So the leadership of the school sees teaching not as something that goes on out there in classrooms while I run the school, but as something that is of direct importance to them, and they take a direct interest in the quality of the teaching. In some schools that I've been to that have really been turned around, again anecdotally, my observation is that it's often the school leader, usually the principal, who's driven this, and often they have a very clear view about the kind of teaching they want to see happening across the school, and they make sure it is happening. They observe what's happening in classrooms, they give feedback. So clear idea about what effective teaching looks like, and then when the school itself is unable to fully meet student needs, thinking about how the school can draw on external resources, other schools, higher education and other education institutions, local community organisations, business groups. Who can we turn to who may be able to help us better address student needs? So again, this could go on, but there are strategies that I believe the research tells us make a difference in improving student outcomes, and they are micro strategies. They're strategies at the level of the school, at the level of the classroom, and it may be possible to drive those through macro strategies, but if macro strategies aren't doing that, if they're not improving the quality of the practice on a day-to-day basis in schools, then I believe the evidence is they're unlikely to be effective. So let me just, winding up here, let me just home in on one of these, differentiated teaching and learning. You'll be able to see from what I said earlier about the curriculum that my view is that this is a key to improving outcomes. It's a key element of reform. It's about addressing individual learning needs, meeting individuals at their points of need. And again, if you look at very high-performing systems, you can sometimes see that they do this quite well. They actually often have systematic strategies for making sure that those curricular gaps that I referred to don't open up too much. So these are system-wide strategies, not just things that individual schools invent, but whole countries have ways of doing this. For example, in Finland, each school employs additional teachers, so there's a cost obviously, but there are teachers in the school. As I understand it, about one teacher for every 7 teachers in the school is dedicated to coming in and working with children who are beginning to slip behind. That may be individually, it may be in small groups, it may be in the classroom, it may be outside the classroom, but the role of these teachers, these additional teachers in Finland, is to intervene and to get kids back on track before that gap opens up too much. And as Michael Barber and Barbara Moorshed observed, by intervening quickly at the level of individual students, Finland, as a country, prevents early failure compounding into long-term failure. Does what it can to stop children from falling further behind in their learning. In East Asian countries, they tend to have other approaches, different approaches, but it's still with the same purpose. If you look at Singapore, here, often teachers will stay behind. They will work with children who've been slipping behind after the formal lessons are over, and they'll provide additional support. Again, with the explicit purpose of trying to make sure that those kids are not falling further behind, that they're on a trajectory that's going to enable them to take advantage of teaching that's still coming. And of course all of this is very consistent with what we know about learning itself. This goes right back to Vygotsky and maybe well before. We know that learning is most likely to occur successfully if you can provide people with challenges that are just beyond where they're currently at, in what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development. So not in their comfort zone, and this is a mistake I think we often make in schools as well. We think we can boost students' self-confidence and self-esteem by giving them tasks on which they can succeed, but the research evidence is that if you want to maximise learning, you give people challenges that they may not be able to handle themselves. They may need support to be able to succeed, but it's just out there beyond that. And to the extent that we're not doing that in our schools, we're not likely to be maximising learning. So the first step in that is to establish and understand where individuals are in their learning. A big challenge, but it means that what teachers need to be doing is not seeing themselves as simply delivering the curriculum, the appropriate curriculum for the grade level, the year level, but becoming researchers in a sense, investigators, trying to explore and understand, to the extent that it's possible in a big group of children, students, to explore and understand where individuals are, even down to what interests them, what motivates them, what are their current levels of knowledge and skill, what misunderstandings have they developed, what are the errors they're making, and what are the underpinning misunderstandings. So that's a first step. Not just delivering the curriculum, but going to the trouble of understanding. And for me, that's what assessment is all about. Assessment, for me, there are lots of different ways of talking about assessment, but for me there is only one way of talking about assessment. There's only one purpose. You can read lots of books that will talk about all the purposes and all the different forms of assessment, but for me there's only one purpose, and that is to establish and understand where learners are in an aspect of their learning at the time of assessment. Maybe do that in some detail. You might need to drill down, might need to diagnose the specific difficulties, but even when you're doing that, what you're trying to do is to better understand where individuals are. So that's the first step, and once you have that information, you can then use it in different ways. You can use it to look at the progress that a child's made over time, to evaluate the effectiveness of your own teaching, for example. Again, people talk about assessment of learning, assessment for learning. I'm not very attracted to those ideas if people think they mean different methods of assessment. Assessment of learning is about looking at the learning that's occurred up to this point. Assessment for learning is about identifying starting points for future teaching, almost at the end. Second step is to design learning opportunities targeted to the levels and needs of individual learners, or perhaps groups of learners. And the aim here is to set realistic but challenging stretch goals for every learner, and ideally to do this in collaboration with students themselves. And then the third step is to monitor the progress that individuals make in their learning, providing feedback to guide further learning. So identifying where they are, tailoring or targeting learning opportunities to where students are at, and then monitoring the progress that they're making. So rather than judging and grading all students solely on how well they meet the year level expectations, and often telling students you're a D this year, you're a D next year, you're a D the year after, actually looking at the progress that even those students are no doubt making, looking at progress regardless of their starting point. And from that perspective, you're taking what Carol Dweck, an American researcher, refers to as a growth mindset. You're thinking about where students are, what progress they're making, and you're evaluating successful learning not in terms of somebody's standards that they've set, but in terms of the hopefully excellent progress that individual learners are making. Let me just stop with a comment on equity. It often may appear that what's equitable is to treat all students the same way, to treat them equally. And I think often in our schools we behave as though that's the case. They're all the same age, they're all Indigenous, they're all low SES, all girls, so we treat them equally. But in my view, equity depends on identifying and addressing each student's needs and expecting every student to make excellent learning progress. Not to think that it's possible to infer an individual's needs from their group membership, as I say, whether it's age, year level or a group defined in some different way. So it's right on 12 o'clock, I think, so I'd better stop before the bell rings.
Three colleagues who are going to give a specific response to Geoff's presentation now this afternoon. And so I'd like to call upon Dr. Brad Campbell, Principal of Emmaus College, to be the first. Thank you, Brad.
Thanks, Ian. And thank you very much, Professor Masters. I very much enjoyed what you had to say. I think there's a lot there for us to discuss, and there was a lot of talk at our table about the impact of those sorts of things, but I'd just like to make a few comments. One is, I think schools are an act of faith, particularly high schools. Anytime you get 1,000 students from 800 families together and you drop them in the one place purely because they live nearby, and then stick them in a room because they're all the same age and try and teach them something, is an interesting concept. If it works, it's a miracle. And I think most days it does work for us, so that's a really important thing. In terms of Australia, I think we need to teach Australians the value of education, because I think that's something that is not highly prized in our community. And so we can talk about the hard work that teachers do, and we can talk about the great work that goes on in schools, but until we can convince them, I don't think the message is going to get through. And it was interesting to note the list of macro reforms that you've got there. One that I think is missing that will feed into a micro reform. I started teaching in 1983, and my original teaching load was 20 hours face-to-face per week. In 2014, with a significantly increased workload and much more expected of teachers, a high school teacher still teaches 20 hours face-to-face per week. And I'm sure my primary colleagues would say the same sort of thing. We know from evidence that the best way to get reform and change within schools is to have teachers observe each other and to critique and analyse their work. Now that would be a micro reform, but that could happen with the macro reform in the change of times that we actually have as far as the face-to-face teaching load. In your speech you touched upon a few things that have become, I guess, mantras for us in the Parramatta Diocese, and one of them has been know your class. And it is significantly important for us as educators to know the students that sit before us, because we're not teaching curriculum, we are teaching students the curriculum and trying to filter that for them. And I think that's a really important distinction to make as well. The challenge for us is to reorganise schools and to make them work on a daily basis so that educational improvement is not just an option, but is an expectation. One of the chapters in Sherry Waddell's book, which has been littered around the tables today, is called Expect Conversion. I think we should be expecting learning and we should be expecting improvement. And that improvement should be based on successful assessment, as you pointed out, because it's about the individual progress, it's not about the comparative progress. As a teacher of English, I would quote one of Michael Gow's characters in his play Away, where she says, "Comparisons are odious, and yet I know they're necessary for our society." But again, with evidence-based change, we've got John Hattie's book on the table, and that's become a bit of a Bible for us as well. So thank you very much for your remarks today.
Thanks, Brad. I'd now like to call upon Yvette Baird, who's the Principal at Sacred Heart Westmead, to also give a response. Thanks, Yvette.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Geoff, for your words today. You raised many concerns that we need to be aware of regarding our placement in the world. But what I was very appreciative of is that you asked us not to be consumed by it. You have emphasised very clearly and succinctly that learning is our core business. What we are learning is about learning, the science, the condition that supports learning at a micro level, the science of the brain, and also the obstacles that prevent learning. Your presentation supports our work in that we are learning what works, and we need to investigate further why it is working. During my professional life, there have been a void of safety nets regarding how to improve student learning areas. But the areas of reform that you have indicated will change how we view education and leadership. The national professional standards of teachers and leaders, the national curriculum, the system monitoring and strategic planning from our diocese, the National School Improvement Tool. This brings together the findings from international research into the practices of how to achieve a highly effective school. Your talk today has ignited greater energy to ensure we have explicit and clear school-wide targets, clear communication which encourages high expectations, school attendance, engagement and outcomes. We have a better whole package than I think we've ever had before regarding explicit improvement agendas, mutual respect and trust for all stakeholders, targeted use of resources, expert teaching team targeting the point of learning for each student, effective pedagogy and productive community involvement. Recalling the words of Bishop Anthony, he said that we now have better stories to share as a diocese, and within our own diocese we have seen success and we're very proud of what we have achieved, and we really need to celebrate. Even a 1% increase is a success. Your paper, Geoff, has given me hope and clarity that all students can learn. And using your words, we have control to make a difference, and I think we have made a difference in each of our individual schools. So thank you, Geoff, for sharing with us the reality of education reform, and we look forward to the challenge.
Thank you, Yvette. And now I'd like to call on our System Learning Director, Sue Walsh, to give her response. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Geoff. We have in our hand our infograph here that we have, which we're very excited about, because this infograph shows us what has happened in Parramatta with our data. Now, we've used our data, Geoff, to challenge ourselves, look at where we're going, seeing if we're improving, and see where we need to focus our work. We've got many areas that we can actually be celebrating. Now, we're not going to say that's fantastic, let's set up shop and we don't have to do anything more for the rest of the time. The reality is our data has actually showed us where we need to go. It actually raised with us very clearly what you've demonstrated so well, the gap between those students could be even as much as 6 years. We know that very well. And what I can tell you is that we know the names of those students because we put a face on those students on our data walls in our schools. They're the explicit talk about case management, and they're the work and the understanding that we find from our instructional walks when we do them each day. 3 key strategies in Parramatta that we began last year that we know that will contribute. And I was excited to know that a lot of our work is focused on the micro strategies, and that we can be confident when we look at the theme this year. The theme is not about going anywhere different, trying to cherry pick a whole lot of other ideas. It's about digging down and really going deep. So I thank you, Geoff, for your presentation today.
To Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much for that. We're going to go to open forum and questions in a moment, but just invite Geoff just to respond to our three respondents before we then open up for questions. Thanks, Geoff.
Thanks, Ian. I don't know that I have much to say, really. I'm pretty much agreed with everything that was said. I thought Brad's point is a very, very good point. I mean, often people may interpret a reduction in face-to-face teaching time as just lightening the load, and see it as a macro strategy that just reduces the amount of face-to-face time that teachers are spending. But the way you linked that macro strategy with the micro reform of then spending the time that's available to work with colleagues, to critique and to analyse practice, look at student work, they're exactly the things that research tells us make a difference. So I'm just repeating myself, I guess, but each of these system level or macro reforms or initiatives that can be undertaken need to be clear about how that's going to enable the kind of practice, in that case critique and analysis of each other's work, that research tells us is going to make a difference. Second, Yvette, was it? Second?
Yvette, yes.
Yvette, yeah. Yvette, yes, your point about the fact that we do know now a lot about what works is a very good point, I think. I've drawn on research fairly heavily in talking about micro-reform strategies, but we do know a lot. We know that not everything works in all circumstances, but we know a lot more about what works, under what conditions, for whom. And we need to recognise that as a profession. I think often we don't adequately appreciate that we do have a significant knowledge base as a profession. Too often we say it's all too context dependent, it's all too difficult, it all depends, but we know a lot. We know a lot about effective school leadership, we know a lot about the characteristics of effective teaching practice, even recognising that there's not one single best way of teaching. And we need to keep building that. The Science of Learning Research Centre that was referred to, a collaboration of the Queensland Brain Institute, ACER and the University of Melbourne, is really focused on this question now. What do we know about learning? What are we learning about learning? And how can we take that learning and apply it in practice? And Sue, I didn't have much to say in response to you at all. I mean, the initiatives that you talked about, the data walls, the case management, the instructional walks, yes, absolutely. They're all things that are very consistent with the points that I was making, and was never my intention today to come and propose something entirely new. If anything, it was to support the practice that's already occurring, and if I've provided some encouragement that you're on the right track, then that's great.
So we move now to questions, and Geoff, don't go too far away because I think there could be a few. So we have John over here and Teresa over here, so it's a matter of just raising your hand and posing a question for Geoff, please.
Geoff, Rob Laidler from Loyola Mount Druitt. During the holidays there was a program on BBC World questioning the PISA model, and I think much of that work was coming out of Cambridge, where they were doubting the capacity of the PISA model to adequately reflect 160 odd different cultural nuances that are out there in world education systems. I wonder if you care to comment on the accuracy of the PISA model and any issues that you've heard recently around that.
Yes, I am familiar with that, and I've seen the OECD's responses to the comments that those British academics were making. And PISA is very ambitious, as you were saying, really. PISA attempts to make comparisons across very different cultures, across languages, many countries, 68 or 9 countries I think currently participate. So there are big challenges in making meaningful comparisons. And no doubt some of the comments that people make have some validity to them. I think I would just say that we're very close. In fact, we've been at ACER, we have managed PISA for the OECD in the first 5 cycles from 2000 to 2012 internationally. We have the best experts we can draw on from around the world giving us advice on how best to do this, as well as our own experts. We do everything we can to minimise the impact of cultural differences and language differences. But we recognise that it's always a minimisation. You can't remove those completely from the equation. And differences across cultures exist and will have some impact. But we think the PISA data are among the best data, not just because we're closely involved, but we think they're among the best, most reliable evidence we have, but also acknowledge that there are limitations to the data. But certainly we wouldn't say they need to be written off, they're not credible. That would be my response.
No, I've got the microphone, can I ask one? Just a question around those international tests again. Is there evidence that effectiveness in those tests then leads to better outcomes, GDP, living standards, better innovation? So I know we're focused very much on international comparisons, but obviously it's disquieting that our students aren't performing at the same level as other countries, but what do the tests really reveal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Part of the response, I guess, is that it's only been running for a few years, since the beginning. It's been running for 10 years, I guess. But it may not be measured, it may not be possible to correlate, to try to understand what the relationship is between performance in PISA and subsequent economic outcomes. What we can see, not in a longitudinal way, but in a more point-in-time way, what we can see is there's not always a very positive correlation. Students in the United States, for example, don't perform particularly well on PISA, and some exceptions at various points in time, the US has performed reasonably well economically and is right on the leading edge of technology. So what's being done in PISA is to try to identify the kinds of skills, the kinds of knowledge in mathematics, in science, in reading, that participating countries believe are important for not only individuals' participation in society, but also lay the foundations for national productivity and economic competitiveness. So it's based on people's beliefs about the kind of learning that's going to be important to those things. But I think at this point, that hasn't been tested as it might eventually be.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. In terms of the measurement tool, could you comment on the percentage of, I'm just trying to think of the skills of reading and comprehension within those tests.
Sorry, what was the question you wanted to ask?
Sorry, the question was, with the measurement tools that you're talking about, because I haven't seen the tools, I'd be interested in the importance of reading and comprehension across all those areas.
There's an assessment of basically reading comprehension. So in PEARLS, the primary level study, and in PISA, the 15-year-old study, the reading components are essentially assessments of reading comprehension.
What I was asking is, for example, when they're testing maths and history and science,
oh, I see.
Are children who have difficulty reading, would they be at a disadvantage in being able to express their understanding of mathematical concepts?
Yes, that's always a risk. And again, it's a matter of trying to minimise the impact of that. When tests are developed, mathematics tests are developed, they're not developed as tests of reading, so we do what we can to minimise the reading demand. But if a child is really struggling with reading, then they're going to have difficulty with mathematics as well. So we can't remove that. Again, we do try to minimise it. What do you think?
That's good. good. Unfortunately, time is against us, and so we'll wind up this what's been an exciting session with Geoff Masters. Let's give Geoff a round of applause.